got to represent my district, and Canada and the state of Washington are have very close trading relationship. It's valuable, and a lot of Canadian-owned businesses are in my district. They hire a lot of people, so I've got to do what's best for the people I represent.
And I say this as somebody that supports the president's agenda of onshoring, reshoring manufacturing. He's absolutely right. There's a lot that we need to be doing. There are a lot of trade imbalances and trade abuses that are happening, but we need to do it the right way, consistent with the Constitution. And I worry about the precedent that we might be setting if there's a Democratic president.
It was a rare rebuke of the White House agenda yesterday as several Republicans joined Democrats to vote against President Trump's tariffs on Canada.
On this vote, the yeas are 219 and the nays are 211. The joint resolution is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Cheers could be heard in the chamber last night as a resolution to rescind some of those tariffs that Trump had imposed on Canada passed 219 to 211. The vote is largely symbolic, as it will still need to be approved by the U.S. Senate and then approved by Trump, who is unlikely, I should say, to sign it into law. But last night's vote saw 6 Republicans break with Trump and join Democrats to pass the measure, signaling a growing willingness from the president's own party to defy him on his trade agenda. Trump took to Truth Social as the vote unfolded, threatening Republicans who voted against the tariffs, saying that they would seriously suffer the consequences come election time. So does this vote signal cracks in the Republican support for Trump's trade agenda as midterms approach? And will it give Canada more leverage when it comes to negotiations? Joining me now to try and answer those questions are Brian Clow. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and lead on Canada-U.S. relations, and Gordon Giffon. He was the former United States Ambassador to Canada from 1997 2001. Thank you both for being here. Gordon, I want to start with you on this one. When you see which Republicans broke ranks, what does that tell you about President Trump's grip on the party and how things could be shifting?
Well, I think it's an early indication that over the course of the next 6 months, we're going to see a little more month-by-month erosion in the support for the president among the Republican caucus, both in the House and the Senate. I've said for some time now, as we get through the Republican primary season, which will end somewhere in the June-July timeframe, and he can no longer threaten to run someone against them in their primaries, his threats will be of less vitality to many of the Republicans in both the House and the Senate, and you'll start to see a few begin to peel away from supporting him as much as they have.
Brian, this is a very different Congress from the first Trump presidency when you were inside the Prime Minister's office. Can you compare the two and how things might be changing here?
Yeah, things are very different now than they were in the first Trump term. Yesterday's vote, it's clearly a good thing on its own as far as these votes go. As you said, it is symbolic. It doesn't carry much weight, but seeing 6 Republicans stand up to their own president, I'm not sure we would have seen 6 stand up to the president 6 months ago. So it's a good step, but it's a small step. Broadly speaking, though, the Republican Party in the United States is still very aligned with this president. They mostly aren't calling him out. They aren't standing up to his tariff policies. And that is very different from Trump in the first term, when we had a lot of allies, both in public and in private, standing with us against Trump's trade policies. I remember being with the former Prime Minister tour of Capitol Hill. We sat down with former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Mitch McConnell said to us, NAFTA's been a good thing for Kentucky. I won't try to do his Kentucky drawl. But he said it was a good thing for Kentucky, and everything Mitch McConnell did, both in public and privately, was, frankly, good for Canada-U.S. trade. We need to see more of that in this second term of Trump.
Brian, I'm curious how you think yesterday's vote landed inside the PMO.
I'm sure they were encouraged by it, but they also know they are facing, and the country is facing, a very, very tough situation. We've been living through, just in the last few weeks, threats from the president on Bombardier jets, threats from the president this week about the Detroit-Windsor Bridge. Just yesterday, the report that the president continues to muse about, privately with his aides, muse about withdrawing from the USMCA altogether. So the vote itself was, I'm sure it was welcomed as good news in the Prime Minister's office, but I'm also sure they're not overly focused on it.
Gordon, do you see this at all as an opportunity now for Canada when you consider that Trump is very transactional as an individual? So do you think that there is an opening here for the Prime Minister to maybe be in a better position to negotiate, or do you think that there will have to be election or electoral impacts on the Trump administration that may, come, let's say, in the November midterms?
Well, I think I'm inclined to think that it's an important event in the moment, and by that I mean as we move towards the renegotiation phase on what we call USMCA. I think it's important for there to be statements like that where it's declared that Canada's different. Canada's relationship, both as a trade matter, but also as a historic ally, makes Canada substantially different than dealing with many of the other countries where President Trump really doesn't have to deal with much pushback because there's not a large number of people in the Congress who have a vested interest in the relationship. Canada is different. The shared border is different. The relationships that have been built between premiers and governors makes it different. And it's not just the economics, it's the long-term engagement that we have had for generations with Canada. And I think statements like the one that was made in the House of Representatives will cause pause in the White House. The president may not immediately get it, but his staff incrementally will. And it's a very constructive statement for the broad relationship, not just the USMCA CUSMA negotiations.
So, Gordon, how do you see this setting up now when you consider some of the factors that Brian also put on the table there? I mean, going from the Davos speech to then the threat against Bombardier Aerospace on this side of the border when it came to Gulfstream jets, and then also the Gordie Howe Bridge. And then, as Brian had mentioned as well, this reporting that he may be willing to just walk away from USMCA. Do you see this building towards a critical point here as we get towards July when a decision does have to be made on that?
Well, it's very difficult to predict the conduct of the current occupant of the West Wing of the White House. On any given night, you'll get some sort of off-the-wall expression, Gordie Howe Bridge being one of them. I think the system is starting to work, however. The institutions are starting to work. The Republicans have been intimidated by him for a year. That intimidation is eroding day by day. And as I said, once the primaries are over, there'll be more that have the courage of their convictions to line up with members of the Democratic caucus in both houses to define what the limits of his power are. And in fact, he can't withdraw without congressional approval. And some of the things that he spouts off about, whether it's Bombardier, whether the Gordie Howe Bridge, it's just sort of the eruption of the moment, and it goes away in 4 or 5 days. So don't be too concerned about some of those events, and let's stick to whether or not we're putting the coalitions together to have rational outcomes over time.
Brian, just in closing, do you think for the Prime Minister right now it is basically hold position, wait to see what comes next, or is it pick up the phone and see if a conversation wants to be had?
Well, I think it's both. And we're seeing the federal government show a willingness to be patient and not rush back to the table, desperate to do any sort of deal. And frankly, that's a good thing for the country. If you go into these talks, if you're calling up the Americans begging to get back to the table, that puts you in a weaker position, and it doesn't make for a good negotiation. At the same time, we know that there are continued conversations going on between the two countries. The Prime Minister and the President have spoken just in the last week. How that translates into the actual detail, the granular detail of the CUSMA review, we'll have to see. Those conversations aren't yet happening in a detailed way, and I think we'll see that pick up in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Brian Clow and Gordon Giffon, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Good to be here.